Abraham Lincoln warned that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. Would you like to know what's being taught in today's classrooms? Welcome to Say What? With attorney Mark Schneider and Pastor George Rosca Jr. They'll explore the issues facing children, parents, and society as a result of the public schools and the forces behind them. Say What is the radio program of Protect Our Kids, which seeks to inform and equip concerned citizens about the looming crisis in American education. So listen in as your hosts, Mark Schneider and George Rosca Jr., unpack the issues and organizations affecting our children. And now here's your hosts, Mark Schneider and George Rosca Jr.
Hello, everyone. I'm George Rosca.
And I'm Mark Schneider.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 92 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including the nonprofit organizations or philanthropists that are pushing this woke ideology on our children.
That's right, George. You know, at the end of the year or start of a new year brings about many decisions on a personal or business level to donate for tax break purposes. But what are the effects and agendas of today's largest philanthropists, right? Particularly as applied to public schools and education. Well, we or more accurately, you have done some investigating into this problem. What are we finding out?
And even more accurately, Parents Defending Education has done actually a phenomenal job of investigating this problem. In fact, in 2021, Parents Defending Education created this consultant report card as a means to expose how tax dollars were being spent by school districts to implement destructive policies and divisive teaching practices such as critical race theory, gender and queer theory, and social emotional learning, which is the triple threat.
The three biggies.
And to expand on this, Parents Defending Education began to investigate how large philanthropic foundations use grant money to advance these practices in public schools. So they took an approach here as part of their investigation, and they only chose 5 foundations to evaluate because there are so many out there. And they only chose from 2017 to 2021, so basically 5 fiscal years, so to speak.
5 foundations over 5 years. That's all they looked at.
That's all they looked at. So this will just give you a glimpse, a peek into how bad it is, let alone if you would do a comprehensive analysis, right? So they ended up looking at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and this one we've talked about on many other episodes because it just comes up very, very often, and we'll see why. Then we have the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and we all know who Mark Zuckerberg is, and his wife's last name is Chan, so they combine that. And then there are some that we haven't heard about and we haven't spoken about, the Wallace Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Windward Fund. You see, overall, what approach Parents Defending Education took is that they had looked at 70 school districts that had been identified as having received grant funding directly from these foundations. So that's 70 school districts across the nation. And in total, these 5 foundations over the 5 years gave over $200 million. $200 million, parents, over 5 years. That's a lot of money.
And these are just the ones that they looked at.
That's it.
Yeah.
I
mean, the real number, if they looked at all the other organizations doing the same thing, is probably multiples of this.
It's way, way bigger. And so just a quick summary of all of the data that they went through in this study. They looked at all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. They filed 207 FOIA requests because they wanted to dig deeper into what that money was being used for. Out of the 207, only 79 actually responded.
Which is interesting because by law, you're required to respond. In fact, there's a notification period where you have to respond. So it'll be interesting to see what the legal ramifications of a non-response are to these requests.
And why are they not responding? What are they hiding behind? Right?
I wonder.
So, in total, All of these 70 school districts spanned 29 different states that had contract. And so there was a total of 249 separate contracts. And there was 2.8 million number of students in these districts.
Just in these districts.
Just in these districts. Yep.
That's a lot of kids. And what's interesting here, George, is that they identified the top 10 consultants. So these are the recipients of this grant money that was given out. And there's some new names here, but there are also some familiar ones. New names like Nusela Inc., Acoben LLC. Maybe you've heard of these. I haven't. But a couple that you and I are very familiar with is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. CASEL was one of the primary beneficiaries of this money. This is the organization that is pushing out SEL curriculums and is lobbying for it across the country. And then another organization, which interestingly enough was the number one recipient of consulting dollars, and that, of course, is Panorama Education, that was co-founded by the son-in-law of Attorney General Merrick Garland.
And this is where I wanted us to take a pause, Mark, because you hit it. We want parents to understand how this money scheme works. You have these wealthy foundations started by billionaires who are putting their philanthropy, to good use, right? And they're checking off some moral checkbox in their retirement, plan. And all of a sudden that money goes into what I'll call shell nonprofit organizations, because a lot of these organizations, we just mentioned 5. There are many other ones. Another famous one is called the Tides Foundation.
They've been around for a long time.
And then from there, you don't know who gave them the money to then in turn give the money to these school districts, right? And so here we have, out of the top 10 consultants identified, because once schools get this money, they don't have the expertise to be able to execute on what the grant says they must do with that money. So then what do schools do? Well, they hire a consultant. And so they bring in now the private consultants who, again, are far left-leaning organizations, ready, willing, and able at any given moment to respond to the call and to say, oh, yeah, we will help you with that. So it's all very well planned and positioned. And to see that Panorama Education was the top consultant recipient by an overwhelming amount they received just out of this $200 million that went out that they were tracking, $19.5 million in contracts out of that $200 million, because some obviously goes for equipment and expenses, so not all of the $200 million goes just for consulting. But the top 10 consultants received that 19.5 million out of that 200.
Yeah, almost 20.
And out of that 19.5, a little over 25% went to Panorama Education, $5.2 million.
I love what Parents Defending Education say here in this graphic. Some people call the network we have documented the, quote, woke industrial complex. Now, Eisenhower, during his administration, coined the term the military industrial complex to talk about the dangers of these collections of groups that have an agenda in mind and who have a lot of money behind them. So I think this is an apt comparison, the woke industrial complex. Others call it the diversity industrial complex. Whatever you call it, says PDE, it's big money. And it is indeed.
It's big money. So let's talk about some of these organizations. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They have donated over the last 5 years out of that $200 million.
Half.
92.3 million.
Almost half.
And in fact, one of their grants went to Denver Public Schools with a $10 million grant that was used to create, quote, college-ready, on-track network for school improvement, end quote. And the initiative's webpage states that its vision is to enable educators, students, and communities through the intentional design and networked improvement to dismantle systems of oppression and prepare all Black and Latinx students.
Woke language, if ever you've heard it, a project that specifically purports to, quote, dismantle systems of oppression, is concerning because it operates under the premise that the United States was founded on white supremacy and racism. It perpetuates the idea that the education system, as well as the United States itself, is oppressive for select demographics, allegedly leading to poor academic outcomes. This places the blame squarely on Western civilization as opposed to the time-honored belief of individual choices and the actions of those involved.
And this continues. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation, they're the number 2 on the list, $59.1 million in donations over the last 5 years. And according to their website, they gave Battle Creek Public Schools $31 million since May 1st, 2017, with grants to be used to transform Battle Creek Public Schools to address structural bias and segregation. Among the programs and policies created to fulfill these grants, it was stated to implement culturally relevant teaching practices because core subjects are traditionally taught from a Eurocentric perspective that minimizes the contributions of people of color, which also can traumatize students of color. Pay teachers to participate in the Transformational Teacher Institute aimed at helping teachers overcome implicit bias and changing school climate, and implemented a program titled Unapologetic Focus on Achievement for Black Boys, which included a book club specifically for Black male middle schoolers.
And for those who are not familiar with this term, culturally relevant, that's actually a term of art in woke education circles. And it relates directly to critical pedagogy from Paulo Freire, this famous Brazilian sociologist. It's all part of critical theory, George. And you see this kind of language interspersed throughout these grants.
The third one, Wallace Foundation, $48.5 million. And their major focus is social emotional learning with a focus on equitable SEL.
Not bad enough to have social emotional learning, which is replacement parenting, but with a woke ideology, now they preface it with the adjective equitable.
And so they say that equitable SEL is defined as affirms diverse identities, incorporates student cultural values, back to what you just said, Mark, practices and assets, fosters positive identity development, meaning gender-affirming care and gender identity, promotes student agency and voice, and acknowledges and addresses persistent environmental stressors such as racism, transphobia, homophobia, and classism. The report goes on to state that all children begin absorbing and internalizing messages about their own racial inferiority or superiority from a very early age. It continues to say that children who are never asked to confront their role in a racist and unjust society are basically part of that systemic structure of oppression.
So these are just 3 organizations that we've talked about so far, and we're well over $200 million in grants given for these woke causes. But we're not done, are we, George?
We got the Windward Fund, $2.6 billion, and their whole focus is on conservation, climate change, food systems policies. But even now, climate change and food system policies and all of that has to do with race, equity, diversity and inclusiveness commitment, which envisions a more equitable world built on fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all. And they are all about equitable outcomes, meaning equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity. And the last one that we'll mention, Mark, is the Walton family. And in fact, they were not even on the top 5 list that parents.
This is the Walton family from Walmart.
This is the Walton family from Walmart. And in fact, Glenn Beck's organization, The Blaze, recently published this article where they were keeping track of just the last 2 years, just the last 2 years, the amount of money that the Walton Foundation has been infusing into woke movement, right? In June 2020, amidst the George Floyd riots, Walmart CEO Doug McMillon announced that the Walmart Foundation and Walmart were committing $100 million to create a new center on racial equity. $100 million. I mean, these people are just throwing money left and right into these woke causes. And then in June 2021, a year later, the Alice Walton Foundation and the Tom Walton, through the Walton Family Foundation, launched the Arkansas's LGBTQ plus Advancement Fund, and they granted its first $1 million check. And guess what they are doing going around all over the state of Arkansas? Drag Queen Story Hours.
George, I mean, this is a say what moment. Only it leaves me speechless. Obviously, there's a profit motive for this. You know, these big companies and their foundations, they want to appeal to what they see as an expanding customer base. They want to be seen as with it and contemporary and woke, you know, and in what they think is the best sense. But this is so insidious, George, and it's corrupting a whole generation of children.
So, Mark, that led me to connect the dots to an article that I read over 4 years ago. And in fact, it was published now almost 5 years ago. And I want you to read this because I copied and pasted just the introduction portion of this article, because there are people that are different from you and I. People might accuse me and you of being Judeo-Christian. We have our own worldviews, right? But this article was penned and it was published in the Federalist, and it was by a person who thinks very differently from you and I. And I want people to get this perspective. And the article was titled "The White Rich Billionaires Pushing Transgenderism."
Interesting title. So here's what the article says. As an environmental activist who was deplatformed from a speaking venue by trans activists in 2013, I developed curiosity about the power of this group to force this development. A year later, when Time magazine announced a transgender tipping point on its cover, I had already begun to examine the money behind the transgender project. I have watched as all women's safe spaces, universities, and sports open their doors to the transgender project, any man who choose to identify as a woman, whereas men who identify as trans women are at the forefront of this project. Women who identify as trans men seem silent and invisible. I was astonished that such a huge cultural change as the opening of sex-protected spaces was happening at such a meteoric pace and without consideration for women's and girls' safety, deliberation, or public debate. Concurrent with these rapid changes, I witnessed an overhaul in the English language with new pronouns and a near tyrannical assault on those who did not use them. Laws mandating new speech were passed. Laws overriding biological sex with the amorphous concept of gender identity are being instituted now. People who speak openly about these changes can find themselves, their families, and their livelihoods threatened. These elements, along with media saturation of the issue, had me wondering, is this really a civil rights issue for a tiny part of the population with body dysphoria? Or is there a bigger agenda with moneyed interests that we're not seeing? This article can only begin to graze the surface of this question, but considering transgenderism has basically exploded in the middle of capitalism, which is notorious for subsuming social justice movements, there is a value in beginning this examination. I found exceedingly rich white men with enormous cultural influence are funding the transgender lobby and various transgender organizations. These include, but are not limited to, the Jennifer Pritzker, a male who identifies as transgender, George Soros, Martine Rothblatt, a male who identifies as transgender and transhumanist, Tim Gill, a gay man, Drummond Pike, Warren and Peter Buffett, John Stryker, a gay man, Mark Bonham, a gay man, and Rick Weiland, a deceased gay man whose philanthropy is still LGBT-oriented. Most of these billionaires fund the transgender lobby and organizations through their own organizations, including corporations. These men and others, including pharmaceutical companies and the U.S. government, are sending millions of dollars to LGBT causes. Overall reported global spending on LGBT now is estimated at $424 million.
And that was just the numbers he had from the previous year in 2017.
Yeah.
And we had looked at 2017 to 2021 with another, and that was just for school districts, not for everything else. We know those numbers are in the billions.
It's so ironic, George, that much of the LGBT community and people that identify with woke ideology, they like to identify themselves as an underrepresented group, right? We're just trying to protect our instruments because we're so pilloried by conservative forces. That is anything but the case. Here we've identified literally hundreds of billions of dollars that are backing these organizations and their agenda.
And these people are very well positioned, not just as billionaires in American society, but for example, the very first name that you read, Jennifer Pritzker, and actually it's a he, and he is the brother, Governor Pritzker of Illinois.
Wow. Yeah.
So these people are very well connected, and they push all of their monies into nonprofit organizations, these foundations that we just read about. They push money into those. And so it is very well orchestrated, very well organized. So parents, please be on the lookout whenever you see on your school board agenda, oh, well, this nonprofit organization is donating this much money for this project. Automatically question it. Your antennas have to go up. Go and do some research, because a lot of times what you will find is that nonprofit organization received money from another nonprofit organization who received money from these nonprofits that we just mentioned. It's a shell game.
Yeah, it's an incestuous relationship between a lot of these organizations. Yeah. They're all supporting one another. Well, unfortunately, George, that's all the time that we have today, and we hope this information has been of value to you. Before we go, we want to encourage you again to visit our website, protectourkidsnow.org. There you can find and share our many brochures that talk about the subjects that we often speak about on this radio program. Watch and share the many videos that we've created. You can also download one of our newest publications, How to Start a Private School. This is a guide that we hope that you could share with your pastors and elders at your churches. You can also request that either George or I or both of us together speak at one of your functions. And please also pay attention to our donate button. You know, POK's mission is to inform parents about dangerous public school indoctrination and alternatives to public schools. So we rely on donors to do this. However, our donor revenue is unpredictable, and that's why we're inviting you to join our Guardian Angels program by making a recurring monthly gift. This will enable us to help more parents get their kids out of the public schools. To learn more about this, visit protectourkidsnow.org/Guardian Angel. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to being with you next week.
You've been listening to Say What, the radio ministry of Protect Our Kids, where they seek to inform and equip concerned citizens about the crisis in American public education and the forces working against our children. Join us at this same time every Saturday as attorney Mark Schneider and Pastor George Rosca Jr. unpack the issues so that we can better safeguard our nation's children. For more information about this program or Protect Our Kids, email the show at info@ protectourkidsnow.org. That's info@protectourkidsnow.org. And join Mark and George right here next week at this same time for another episode of Say What.